The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Oh, we're still waking up. Let's try that again. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
It is good to be with you to this morning. We are starting off a very exciting year in Westminster Sunday School. The last several years, we've been trying to stretch out and do long, big topics over the year. This year is a little different. This year, we're going back to our old model of kind of a mishmash of different things. So if you find, this isn't really all that interesting to me, I don't know how that's going to happen, because I know we're doing all the really interesting work. But you can come and go, and you're not going to miss something if you miss a couple weeks here or there, right? For the next 5-6 weeks, we're going to be studying vices and virtues. Then Jay and I, along with Andrea Ramsey, are going to be teachers. So from Malone, what is her title again?
Director of Multicultural Services.
Thank you. That is her title, and she, as well as we, will be teaching a course on African American religious biographies. So we're excited for all the possibilities of this year. Excited you are here, whether you are joining us live or after the fact on YouTube, or you are here in person. We're glad you're here. In about 2 weeks, is it the 25th, Jay, that you are gone?
Right.
So Jay is going to be teaching this course for the next couple of weeks, and then after that as well. But he has one weekend where he is gone. And several of you over the last couple of months have asked me some really good questions. And I said, let me think about that. Let's sit down. Let's have coffee. Let's talk about that another time. So in 2 Sundays, September the 25th, is going to be an opportunity for you to ask the pastor. So you have little pieces of paper there with some pens. If you have some deep theological question you've always wondered about, you don't know what to do about this or that verse of the Bible, or what do we Presbyterians really believe about this, feel free to write that down on that piece of paper and get it to me. We're bringing in the reinforcements. Pastor Ben and I will be here to answer your questions in 2 weeks. So that means if you give me a question, you have to be here to hear the answer, right? In years past, people have given me all these questions and then they didn't come, right? So be sure to give me some interesting questions. You are the ones that are building that class for September 25th. Just a moment, I'll turn things over to Jay, but before I do, let us go to God in prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day, the opportunity to join together, to be together in community, and to learn more about your church, your saints throughout the ages, and how you are calling us to faithfulness, to virtue over vice. Help us, God, to receive and to be transformed by what we learn today. May all that we do, say, and learn this day prove glorifying to you. And Lord, may you empower and give strength to Jay as he leads and directs this class. We pray this all in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Jay.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here again this morning. Starting off this topic on vices and virtues. Let me start, first of all, with a very short, basic definition, and then get into some introductory things about vices and virtues. A vice is a type of sin that becomes a persistent habit or a pattern over time. And a virtue is similar in that it's a moral quality, but it's also one that we develop over time through patterns and habits and practices. And so the key there is that there are habits and practices to both of these things. Okay, so that's the basic definition here. Now I'll start with a story. This past summer, I found myself at my alma mater, University of Notre Dame, playing golf. I was on a week-long sort of family reunion, and my brother and brother-in-law and nephews, we do this every year, and they like to go out golfing. I'm a terrible golfer. I only play once a year or maybe once every 2 years when I am with my brother-in-law and my brother. And as a result of being a terrible golfer, I find myself way off in the rough a lot of times. And in fact, I don't keep score, because if I kept score, I would just be miserable. It's just to go out and enjoy some time with members of my family. Well, I do have a little alternative game that I play. I don't keep regular score, but I do keep score in terms of how many balls do I lose versus how many balls do I find. And it's a good day if I can find more balls than I lost. That's kind of where the real game is. So here I am at Notre Dame, and I am playing golf, and I find a ball as I'm looking for my other ball, which I think I lost and never found. And I pick it up. It has a name on it, and it's called Vice. Now, if you don't know, golf balls all have names, the names of the companies, Titleist and Slazenger or Bridgestone or Callaway or whatever. And I'd never heard of this one before. I guess it's a relatively new company that named their golf balls Vice. And that seemed kind of, at first, kind of an odd name to me. Vice. Who calls a golf ball Vice? Why would a company choose this name? And obviously what you're doing is when you choose a name, you're thinking with an audience in mind. So I was thinking, well, there's got to be an audience, right? A demographic. What kind of demographic would find it appealing to buy a golf ball named Vice? And then, since I'm on the campus of Notre Dame, it hit me. Catholic baby boomers. And Catholic baby boomers for this reason, and this is my thinking, not just because I happen to be on the golf course in Notre Dame, you're going to have a lot of Catholic baby boomers playing there anyway, but here, what? First of all, the concepts of vice and virtues were a key part of Christian thinking for centuries. It goes all the way back to, well, this is a painting of Augustine. You can go back before him to a number of what we call the Desert Fathers, more on them in a minute, and then continues on through Aquinas and so forth. But actually, both Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, vice and virtue were a key part of it. But Protestants largely moved away from this tradition, and more on that later. But this was something, and has been something, that's been stronger in Catholic circles, and so it continues on to this day in many Catholic places where that's part of their education. So that's the first part. The second part, the baby boomers part. Well, those of you who are baby boomers, that, growing up or coming of age in the 1960s or 70s, there was a certain kind of thrill in rebelling against the establishment and the established rules of behavior, and so we throw phrases around, we're born to be wild and we're free as a bird now, and, we want revolutions and things like that. So what I picture is, in my mind, I'm holding that golf ball that says Vice, and I picture a Catholic boy back in a Catholic high school in the late 1960s, and he's in ninth grade class on ethics, and Sister Josephine is lecturing about vice and the 7 deadly sins, and the boy is hating it, and because he's in the ninth grade, and he's only getting part of it. Because ninth grade is about the worst time to try to teach morality to a boy. And as a result, he grows up thinking about vice in much the same way C.S. Lewis mentions this in a slightly different way. He talks about, in Mere Christianity, he talks about the boy who believes that God is the sort of person who's always snooping around to see if anyone is enjoying himself and then trying to stop it. Or what H.L. Mencken in the 1920s said about the Puritans. A Puritan is somebody who's deathly afraid that somebody somewhere is enjoying themselves. And so he grows up, our hypothetical Catholic male concludes that vices are those things in life that are a lot of fun, but are not really so bad, really, like maybe drinking or smoking or rock music or racy movies or something like that. And so decades later, at the age of 65, he comes across a golf product named Vice, and yes, that does appeal to him. In fact, I checked out the website of Vice, and they explained why they chose this name. Because being bad is so good. There it is. I think it works. Now, 2 observations from our golf ball here and our hypothetical Catholic baby boomer golfer. I think in popular culture, vice can seem relatively harmless to a lot of people because, a lot of people do think of it as, just, the fun things that you're supposed to, that you want to do that some people say you shouldn't do, or just fun things that maybe are just a little bit bad for you, maybe drinking cocktails or wanting to free oneself from rules about sex or the desire to make a lot of money. Then being bad really is good. But if vice includes addiction to opioids or systematic sexual harassment of women, or embezzling several $100,000s from a nonprofit that helps disabled children, then it's obvious that this kind of being bad or breaking bad, if you will, actually is quite bad. So which one is it? And the answer is it's both. But my main point here is that most people don't have, we kind of have an idea of what a vice is, but in popular culture, it's not all very clear. My second point, actually I have a lot of points. Okay, here's the next point. Protestants. Protestants have largely abandoned the language of vice and virtue, and this happened in the Reformation because there had been so much teaching about developing virtue in the Catholic Church that following Martin Luther, this sounded an awful lot like works-based justification, right? Works-based theology, and Protestants reacted against that, and so they worked, pun intended, to build a theology in a church and based on grace alone. And so that, I think, is one of the main reasons why the tradition of and the language of vice and virtue did not continue on as strongly among Protestants, and so we don't tend to use those terms today. Although there are people, especially in recent years, who have started to bring this back and look at this more carefully again. Billy Graham and Tony Campolo and Os Guinness have all written books on vice, on the 7 deadly sins. But I don't know how popular they have been. I didn't realize that they had written. When I say popular, sometimes it just means I haven't heard of it. Maybe I'm completely wrong about that. But I hadn't heard on these books till I was reading this. And then another example of this, a few weeks ago, I picked up Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I was looking for something in it. Now, I have read Mere Christianity over my lifetime, I think 3 times. The last time I read it was about 4 or 5 years ago, and I remembered something that he was said, and I wasn't looking for vice and virtues, but there was something I was looking through to try to find what he said about this, and I'd been thinking about vices and virtues, and lo and behold, I discovered that the entire 3rd section of the book, Book 3 in Mere Christianity, is all about Christian virtue and the practices of Christian virtues. And a key chapter in that section of Mere Christianity is C.S. Lewis talks about the source of all really vices is the great sin, he calls it, is pride. Which is classical Christian thinking going back centuries and centuries and centuries, that all vices grow out of pride. And my point there is, how come I had read Mere Christianity and this just didn't hit me? It didn't stick with me. Here is C.S. Lewis. I kind of remember him saying things but like this, but I didn't, that language of virtue and that language of vice didn't stick with me. And if you look actually at C.S. Lewis's writings, the Screw Tape Letters and the Chronicles of Narnia and a lot of the Great Divorce, embedded in there when he's talking about human character is always this tension between virtue and vice. He understands this really very, very well, and that makes sense because he's a scholar of medieval literature when that just suffused all kinds of writings. So, why should we then study the vices and the virtues? And I think the primary reason is we are called to be more like Christ. We are called to imitate Christ, to be Christ-like. And to do that, as C.S. Lewis says, you have to study the bad news first, some vices, before you can get to the good news. And then you understand why the good news is really, really good news. The 7 virtues. And so historically, I do want to say this, in this series, I'm going to do mostly vices. Maybe at a later time, I have to read more on the virtues. Maybe at a later time we could do something on the virtues. But I'm going to refer to virtues in general. But historically, there were 7 Christian virtues, practical wisdom, which is we sometimes call prudence. I don't know, we don't use the word prudence much anymore, but that's why practical wisdom fits better. Justice and courage and temperance, and then faith, hope, and love. These are characteristics that we want to develop as Christians. 4 of them, the first 4 actually were common in Greek and tradition about virtue, but also, at least in the time period before Christ, in the centuries before Christ, Jewish literature and tradition had developed those also. And then faith, hope, and love, are very deeply biblical. But Augustine, by the way, some people say Augustine. I say Augustine when I'm talking about the town, St. Augustine, or Bob Dylan's song, I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine. But then I went to Augustine when I got to graduate school, and all the other scholars would say Augustine, and I wanted to look good in front of them, which, by the way, is a vice of vainglory, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so I adopted Augustine also. So that's just how that goes. And so now it's a habit ever since. See, there, yeah, practical sort of things that come. But Augustine said that these are all actually Christian virtues. And part of what he did was he laid these out as these are all deeply Christian. All right, we're going to also then talk about what are sometimes called the 7 capital vices, or the 7 deadly sins, maybe in popular terminology. That's the language that is more familiar to us. I think there's reasons why I like capital vices better than 7 deadly sins. First of all, there's a vice is a particular type of sin, and which I'll get to in a minute. And deadly, well, there's some theological differences there between Catholics and Protestants, and I'm still enough as a Protestant to say, I don't know about anyway, I'm not going to get into that theology, but we're going to call it the capital vices. Traditionally, lust, gluttony, envy, anger, vainglory, which is often replaced with pride, but I think there's a good reason to say vainglory and pride are very similar, but there is a key difference there. Avarice and sloth. And we're going to hit 5 of them. The first 5 on this list: lust, gluttony, envy, anger, and vainglory, for no other reason that mainly than it's just an organizational thing. Don't read into any sort of theological principle there. I'm not as systematic as Augustine and Aquinas were. So that is what we're going to be doing. These come from, or this tradition of the vices developed way back in the early church, when you have a group of people called the Desert Fathers, who were a group of highly committed Christians who in North Africa went off into remote areas. They are, in essence, the first monks, if you will, and go off for study and contemplation. And part of it was theological, a lot of it was spiritual, and then the theology grew out of this. But they wanted to imitate Christ, and Christ went off into the wilderness, right? The 40 days in the wilderness, and faced all sorts of temptations, and their thinking was, if we are to imitate Christ, we're going to go off into the wilderness and try to face these temptations and hit them directly head on and try to become as Christ-like as we can. And discovered, or maybe they knew before they went out, that this is really hard. It's really hard, or as C.S. Lewis says, anybody who says it's easy to be good hasn't ever really tried hard enough to really try to be good at something. But my main point here is that for the Desert Fathers is the thinking about vices grows out of long periods of practice, because then after the Desert Fathers, other people, Augustine and Gregory the Great, and then other Christian thinkers, and Aquinas on down, build on this and expand from this. And so we have this tradition, I think riches, really, that we can draw into, because they have some great insights into human nature that come out of years and years, actually centuries and centuries of practice. I am drawing a lot from, this is, if you want a book, this is a great book. This is where I'm drawing a lot from. Rebecca Canindike DeYoung has written a book called Glittering Vices recently, and I just highly recommend it. It's really a great book. She's a professor at Calvin University. They made, for years, it was always Calvin College, and they changed it to Calvin University. I'm trying to make that adjustment. But Rebecca Canindike DeYoung explains, the way she explains vices and virtues is she describes them as like grooves that you cut in the snow when you are going sledding. Now, she's from eastern Michigan, where they do a lot of that. I'm more used to cross-country skiing. And so to me, I thought, well, in my mind, it worked better to think about it as cross-country skiing, that when you cut those grooves, and of course, a good cross-country ski course, they will actually go out and cut the grooves for you. Actually, I was just looking for a picture. I found out you can buy these things yourself, or you can buy a little thing to put on the back of your tractor or whatever. Anyway, if you're really, really into cross-country skiing, you can do that. But the point is, you get in that groove, and with repeated practice, that snow gets packed down, and it's hard, and it's icy, and you can zip along so much more, so much easier if you're in those grooves that are cut in the snow, as compared to trying to blaze that first trail or even the second or third trail. Just you can picture those hard, almost icy grooves that you glide along in, which is a great thing if the trail you have blazed is the church. I was triple tithing. That's 30%. And I'm glad I didn't know that at the time, because it would have just added to my pride and vainglory. But the idea is, I got in the habit. If you've never given and you want to start giving regularly, it's hard to get that started. It's like cutting those grooves in the snow for the very first time. And so that's what a virtue is. And of course, on the flip side of it, if you've developed a vice, we probably to some extent or another have developed bad habits. It's just much easier to stay in that habit, and it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to get out of that, and and the only way to get out of a vice, well, I don't know about the only way, but the main way to get out of the vice is to cut a new path, a virtuous path, if you will. So a vice is a particular dimension of sin. And if we think of sin, we realize there are a lot of different dimensions to sin. A sin, most commonly, is an act that we commit, but it also can be an act that we don't do. Sins of omission. I really should have given money, and I didn't. That is a consequence of sin. Sin also refers to our fallen human nature, the condition, that we all have, that we're born with. It also refers to just the fallenness of creation and the world that we live in. But then there is sinful habits and patterns. And that's the particular kind of sin we're looking at here, that habit and pattern over time. The capital vices, I'll go back. These are not... Maybe I'll go back. I get a point this way? Or what did I do? There we are. These are not the only vices out there. And I think that's important to realize. And they're not necessarily the worst possible sins. that we can get that impression, or necessarily the hardest to cure, or those that will put you on the fast track to hell. That's what you can sometimes get if they're deadly sins. But what they are, they were seen to be, by these ancient Christian thinkers, they were seen to be particularly powerful vices that led to many others. They're like the source of many, or they often pictured, the early thinkers pictured vices as a tree, and the trunk and the roots were pride, and then just the first main branches were the 7 capital vices. And from those branches, you get other branches, right? And other, that grow out from there. And so that's why it was thought that these were worth looking at this morning. So this morning, we're going to start with lust, and mainly just because it fits into the schedule. And it illustrates several themes about vices in general. I don't have any real theological reason for starting with it. It's just purely organizational. All right, and to start with lust, I may do this from time to time with vices. Back in quite a while ago, a few decades ago, 1987, Harper's Magazine ran a feature in which they asked advertising agencies to come up with an ad campaign to sell a deadly sin. And my thought is, why do they have to come up with something new? Why not just draw upon some of the ad campaigns they already have? But, some blonde woman on a card. I mean, you're selling lust. But anyway, they obviously it's a particular kind of, I think it speaks to kind of the, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, kind of, vices. They're not really bad. It's, because being bad is so good. And, making fun at these things a little bit. And, it's 1987, so all the ad campaigners were baby boomers anyway, and they'd, been through rebellion and so forth. So the first one for lust was they came up with, any sin that's enabled us to survive centuries of war, death, pestilence, and famine can't be called deadly. And I define this on the internet. It's the only image I could find of this, but the one down at the bottom that you can't read, it says lust. Where would we be without it? Okay, with the side note from where I got it, that all the ad agencies wanted to do lust, and only one of them got that. Yeah, so the first point I think is, this is kind of funny, and it works because, again, going back to my earlier point, I think we have a misunderstanding of what vices are. This works because we have that view, because being bad is so good. And the other misunderstanding is it only works if we think that sexual desire and lust are the same thing. And I think for a lot of people, sexual desire, and lust are the same things in their minds. And I think that I don't know, it seems to me that may be more true today than it was 35 years ago. But that's an error. They're not the same thing. And so here's my second point, and this is true about all the vices. And this comes largely from Augustine again, and a great insight. And that is that vice, sin, evil, these are not created things. Evil or sin is taking something good and distorting it, or disordering it, or using it in some excessive way, or for some purpose for which it is not intended. Because Augustine says, God is the creator of the universe, only creates what is good. And so sin and evil are not created things. They are a misuse of God's creative things for purposes that they were not intended, or for disordered sort of purposes, a misuse. And so sexual desire is something created by God. And so sexual desire is something that is very good. And we can go back to Genesis, right? And this is before the fall. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So here we have one purpose of sex, which is procreation, children, and it is a blessing, and it is a commandment. And then a little bit later on in Genesis, therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And now you have this wonderful mystery about what that means to become one flesh. But that's a deep blessing that speaks to intimacy and deep caring and love between two people, and sex in the proper context is a part of that. And so sex is designed to bond two people together. It's a gift. And as Rebecca Canine-Dyke DeYoung says, life and love are at stake here. And if life and love are at stake here, then it's both, right, life, creating new life, and a deep kind of love. Not the only kind of love, but one deep kind of love are at stake here. So it's actually very, very important and very, very good. And it's good also in a way in that sex gives us pleasure. That is part of the gift. And now here's where things get tricky and messy, of course. And that is because pleasure is related to fulfillment, but it's not the same thing as fulfillment. And so here's where we get Augustine talking about distortion of something good. When we make pleasure the highest goal and purpose, or think that pleasure is fulfillment, now we've taken something good and we've started to distort it, and then we can get into some really bad places. Third point, I'll go back to this. The source of the vice of lust is pride. So, and this is, as I mentioned before, but I want to spend a minute on this. Actually, originally, the list, of the 7 capital vices varied a little bit over time. And this is not, very, what I want to say, particular doctrine that has to be a particular sort of number. But some people included pride as a vice all on its own. But some of the, I think, more influential thinkers, and this makes sense to me, see pride as the root, or if you think of that tree again, the tree trunk of all the other vices. And we have to think then about what pride is. And pride is when I think I know better than God what is going to be good and how I'm going to be fulfilled in life. It's me trying to engineer my own happiness and my own fulfillment on my own terms. What I want, disregarding God for that. And with that definition, sorry, I'm just reading other people, what they think, and I agree with them, is that it fits with all the other vices. And really, every sin, when you come down to it, that we commit is us saying to ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, well, I know what's good, or what's going to make me happy, or I know this isn't good, but I'm going to be fulfilled even for just this one moment. If I take these cookies out of the cookie jar, or that's a nice innocent 5-year-old sin, isn't it? Innocent. Sorry, that's not the right word. I don't know. Can you rank sins? That's another great debate Christians get into. Anyway, it's perhaps fine as long as it doesn't turn into a vice. We'll call it that. Taking cookies out of a cookie jar is a much bigger problem if it becomes a vice. And then, someday you find yourself taking money out of the nonprofit till, if you will. Anyway, so pride is trying to engineer our own happiness, and so lust as a vice is as I'm looking at sexual desire, I decide where to get it, how to get it, from whom. And of course, it doesn't deliver the fulfillment that we think it does. And so Rebecca Konyndyk DeYoung says this is the paradox of pleasure. When we misuse something habitually, in a habit, and get caught into that groove, we lose the ability to appreciate its true goodness. And when we lose the ability to appreciate its true goodness, we get less pleasure from it. And so the problem that leads to a lot of other problem with the vice of lust is that there's the law of diminishing returns. That when we fall into the vice of lust, and studies show this, that people that fall deeply into the vice of pornography habitually find that they have to keep returning more often and more often to get the same thrill that they did, first of all, because over time, and this is how drugs work also, isn't it? That you're trying to get the same buzz, and then after a while you have to take more to get the same sort of buzz. But then also with pornography, because you can't get the same buzz, you not only go back more times, but also then start exploring other sort of novelties, if you will, or what, the old word that we used, which was perversions. It's really sort of being disordered again and again. And of course, then that can lead to real problems. So, being bad is so good. No, with lust, the Me Too movement would point out, right, that people, often men, who habitually harass or abuse women, that's not good. And that doesn't just pop up. It isn't someday a man just decides that he's going to improperly touch a woman. It is the end point of habits that have developed and patterns where the step goes up further and further. And very oftentimes, right, in the Me Too movement, we find it's men who have a lot of power and have not been held accountable. And because they have not been held accountable, that allows them to go one step further. And maybe sexually harass a woman and not be held onto it, and then they more likely or more willing to do it again in another time. And this, of course, has created some cultural problems to it, and maybe this is another point about vices, is that they can be embedded in our culture in such a way that our culture can encourage. I mean, one small step is, we like vice because being bad is so good. That's maybe the gateway drug into vices, if you will. And in lust, we can see this in a lot of different ways, but a particularly damaging way. A couple months ago, I was reading an op-ed piece in the New York Times by a woman that was talking about women and sexuality and relationships with men, and you can see them trying to balance as baby boomers once again, trying to balance the things from the sexual revolution that they thought were great and wonderful with now some of the consequences that they're dealing with. This writer referenced I don't know what venue it was, but some woman who said apparently now among and I think from what the article said, this may be coming through pornography, that there are many men who are now turning to choking women in the midst of sexual activity, and that's a thrill to them. And so this woman has said, is it wrong for me to tell my partner that I don't like that? And I think, well, we've gotten to the point where if we're not even sure that that's wrong, and if we're not even sure that you should be able to tell somebody not only that you don't like it. I mean, you need something even more powerful than you don't like. Like no, this is not right. Then we've got some problems as a culture. I think of Trevor Bauer, who used to pitch for Cleveland and then pitched for the Los Angeles Dodgers. If you follow baseball, these things come out in the news. He has been suspended and has not pitched for, I think, 2 years, and he's awaiting trial because there's a woman who's accused him of sexual abuse, part of which was choking her in the midst of sex. Apparently, he had kind of advertised anybody who wants rough sex, and the woman came, but there was I don't know what happened. Well, none of us know, but that was a part. I mean, if you're advertising for it and the woman comes and it turns out to be more than what she expected, or other things that were involved that left her physically damaged and maybe emotionally damaged. Suddenly our culture, right? That's just an example of where our culture has maybe encouraged certain kinds of vices that are really pretty damaging. So yeah, something's amiss here. Something you've taken something good, a gift from God, and we have damaged things. Frederick Buechner said, "At its roots, the hunger to know someone sexually is the hunger to know and be known by that person humanly. Food without nourishment doesn't fill the bill for long, and neither does sex without humanness." Food without nourishment, right? That's pleasure without fulfillment. That's not being used in a particular sort of way. Now, so I point to the culture out there, like it's those people, which also then can be the sin of pride, because we Christians need to realize that we haven't always gotten this done well with sex ourselves, in terms of understanding and playing it out. It's quite possible, I don't know, somewhere along the line, historically, Christians, somehow, there are some Christian groups that sort of upheld sex as a particularly bad sin. Or maybe sex itself is bad and lost the sense of the created goodness of sex. Or that sex is in some ways very much a worse sin than any other sin that there can be, right? So if you look at our movie ratings, which were created in response, a lot of times, to objections from Christians, the number one rating that determines something is sex, which of course is a problem, but there are a whole bunch of other sins out there, folks, and a whole bunch of other, we don't ever, say, oh, don't watch that movie, it promotes greed. And so, historically, this is something that seemed to happen in the late 18th century, and I'm not exactly sure why. I haven't read, I just caught this in bits and pieces I haven't read studies particularly on this. But maybe, it's quite possible that pre-modern Christians had a healthier approach to sex than we Christians today did. One of the more common books of the Bible to preach on in the medieval era was the Song of Songs. I don't know how many sermons I've heard on the Song of Songs or Songs of Solomon. Maybe not any. I can't remember. The Puritans preached sermons about sex. And the sermons were, of course, that it has to be within marriage, but they spoke of marriage as a training ground for learning how to love God. And they, in fact, their sermons embarrassed Victorian historians later on who came back and read them and were like, what do we do with this? They're preaching about sex. The Puritans were not very puritanical when it came to sex in that way, except that they did, because they were Puritans, command the people in the congregation certain things. And one of the things they commanded is, husbands and wives, you must love each other, and you must love each other through sex. Like, you have to do this. Puritans. Yeah, they're kind of a fun group. So I think sometimes in the last couple of centuries, Christian groups can, you get caught in this sort of false dichotomy about sex being either totally awful and evil, or else sex is just pure pleasure without thinking about it as fulfillment. And a couple last points here, and then I'll open it up for discussion and questions. But one place I see this played out recently in the last couple of decades is how, here, let's turn to a statistic. Oh, there's Frederick Buechner. Sorry. I can go back to that if you want to. But this statistic, 77% of evangelical millennials believe that sex outside of marriage is morally wrong. 80% of evangelical millennials have had sex outside of marriage. Okay, so what is going on here? And by the way, I don't know, it's possible that the bottom percentage is even higher today. This is maybe 4 or 5, 6 years old. I'm not sure when I got this statistic. But about 10 or 20 years ago, you might remember there was a big push for purity campaigns. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there were some churches that were trying to help youth, I think with very good intentions, deal with a really overly sexualized culture that we live in many ways in terms of media. And the solution was the vow of purity. And so you'd get the youth group together, and you'd have them all make a commitment. I'm going to, not have sex until after marriage. And some places would even give girls a purity ring, and they'd wear a ring, and there's a great thing about that. You're addressing the issue, which a lot of times is ignored in decades before this. You're asking for commitment, which I think a lot of young people need to practice commitment. Most young people don't seem to make long-term commitments to much of anything except for tattoos, and so they need, I think, practice in commitment. That is fine, but and I think one of the reasons this, from my observation, the campaign has largely died out is that it didn't work, or didn't work the way that a lot of Christian leaders hoped. And the studies showed that youth that went through the purity campaign, not really a noticeable difference in terms of, from those who didn't go through purity, in terms of their sexual behavior, or at least having sex, trying to say save sex until marriage or that sort of thing. And I think one of the main reasons for that is this, that there's sort of a Protestant impulse there where we missed how vice works and we missed how virtue works. Saying, making a commitment is good, but that's not enough. You need the spiritual discipline. You need the practices. You need the habits. And so in our culture in which we are being bombarded with so many appeals for sexuality, and habitually, just by accident, you can just like walk through the grocery store magazine article, you get all these covers just blaring at you because those practices are there. We need to replace it with another practice, and the purity campaign didn't offer much in terms of what habitual sort of things do you do then to, and I tell you what, I feel bad for young people today because, in the wake of the sexual revolution, it's even more powerful, it seems to me. I mean, the sexualized nature, or the distorted sexualized nature, may be even worse. Now, I don't know if my analysis is right on that or not, but I think what is true is that we need to replace it with virtues, a vice. And I don't have a good solution for youth on exactly what particular virtues to replace it with, or how to develop those virtues, but they need to be some sort of spiritual. We all need, this is maybe then my point, because it's true of all virtues, we all need to have habits and spiritual disciplines that direct us back into the right paths that order our lives. One of them, I will say, is this, is regular attendance, Sunday morning worship. That Sunday morning is a practice, a habit that develops good qualities within us. This is where God works. This is where this is where we put ourselves in a place where we are more open to think and accept gifts from God and the grace from God. And so, Sunday morning, and a little bit later here, you go into worship, you're opening yourself up to God instilling gifts in you, and regular practices on that are one step. And I'll talk maybe a little bit later about other aspects of virtues a little bit. But I think replacing the vice with practices of virtues is what Augustine and Aquinas and others said. That's how you deal with that. So let me open up comments, questions, observations. Yes?
So as you were talking about lust, you referred to the Me Too movement, and a lot of what the Me Too movement is referring to is harassment and assault. Those are not sexually driven, they're power driven.
Well, that's...
And so I'm trying to understand if that conflation is intentional as part of the disordering of lust, of sexual desire. But to me, it's separated out. That's a power play to minimize and harm, and the weapon that's used is objectification or sex, not that it is a
Yeah.
physical act to sexually harass someone.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. And I think part of the complication is that sins and vices overlap. But you're right, it is. And so that may not have been the best example. But I think sexual vice is a part of it. But the deeper vice there on power may be wrath or anger, the desire to, or a certain type of pride. There may be an anger at women that's underlying a lot of that a lot of times, and then the sex is what's used for that. So these things do overlap. But I think that is a very good point, that you can fundamentally see that as. But either way, it's some sort of combination of vice that is built up. But I think that's right. I think it's appropriate to maybe think of that as primarily maybe a different vice than that uses lust as the weapon. Yeah, I think I would accept that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I haven't studied that. And I was just pulling out an example, and now that I think about it, yeah, maybe that wasn't the best example in this situation, but yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the Jewish historical origins of the virtues. Is that all, do the vices come to us also, at least in part, through that deep history and the Hebrew?
Oh yeah,
Bible?
yes,
I mean, I think
certainly.
you see that in a lot of it.
Yes, certainly, certainly in part. I think what the Desert Fathers did was really in many ways take a lot of biblical principles and just organize them in a particular kind of way, or draw deeper insights. That's what a lot of times what theology does, right? But certainly, yeah, that's a very good point. The roots of this, of this way of thinking about sin, certainly you do find in the Old Testament, and there are practices that are designed to encourage virtue in the old, that really is what the laws, the law, the Torah is designed to do, is to try to encourage virtue. Now Jesus comes and takes it even further, I think, but then that's another issue, which maybe we'll get into, the question of the law and then the question of the heart. But certainly, yeah, I think that's a good point. Roots in Jewish practice, yeah.
So I'm wondering, as you've been emphasizing and saying that, through the course you're going to emphasize the vices, that the church has become so identified with the anti-vice.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, we have not done a good job of presenting a positive alternative. And so I wonder if that needs to be kind of our focus of kind of how do we alter our message?
Yeah.
That the negativity doesn't get us anywhere creative, and if God is a God of grace and transformation, what are we missing that we get lost on just don't do this? The just say no has not worked in any condition.
Yes.
And so I don't know, I'm just wondering through the course of this how we can keep coming back to what can we as a church in activity and in focus do differently. So.
I think that's a great question. And sometimes as I'm going through this, I'm thinking, oh, I'm tired. And I think this will be maybe maybe a weakness or a problem with the upcoming lessons, is that they do focus on vice quite a bit, and because I don't have as much, I need to do more reading and material to see what people have written on virtues. And maybe that is because there hasn't been as much written recently on virtue. This is, from what I understand, more of a recent meaning, for a historian, recent is anything that happens in the last 100 years, but recent in the last 20 or 30 years among a lot of Christians to bring this up. But we do need, I think that's exactly right, to think about how do you develop virtues, how do you develop character, both individually and collectively as a church. That is true. And I, on the other hand, I'll go back to one side. You do have to wonder, is C.S. Lewis right in saying that you can't get to the good news unless you go to the bad news first? We don't want to get to do the bad news and not get to the good news, but historically, there have been Protestants who have really downplayed sin quite a bit and downplayed evil quite a bit. And almost ignored it and gotten to the point where human nature is basically good. And I think that didn't turn out well either. So that's the other, that's where we get into, there's good discussions that can be had on that. And I don't have a good, clear answer to that. I'm just thinking of different sides that I can see. But I think you are absolutely right. We do need discussions on what does it mean to develop good character. How do we grow in virtue? Really, how do we become more Christ-like? We need to have not only deep thinking about that, but you're right, deep practices that we can encourage among other people. And I think that's an excellent point.
So is it 2 golf balls, or do you just turn the golf ball over and virtue's on the other side?
What's the proper analogy here? I don't know. I have to think about that. Another thing to think about, yeah. What if what we're doing are golf balls, what would it look like? Yes.
They podcast.
Oh, okay. I think to go along with what Edith said, though, I think it is when we go back to the purity ring and talking to youths about these kind of things, I think it is, how do we develop a better rhetoric beyond pure and impure?
Yes.
Because I think that's where a lot of people get lost, is that we focus on the sin and not the redemption. Mm-hmm. And I think it's what are good ways to maybe discuss these things with people in a way that isn't so rigid?
Yes.
Because
yes.
I think that's ultimately why the purity movement failed, is
yes.
because it ostracized way more people than it included. So
yes.
That's just my piece.
Yes, that's an excellent point, and I agree with that. And in that standard, purity is almost an impossible. Okay, so first, we don't ever talk about financial purity. Have you achieved financial purity? Have you used every aspect of your money to a point where you've never stepped over the line? You know, so we do sex that way, number one. Number two, I may think you're right with this. We're all, in some sense, sexually disordered, but we're also disordered in other ways too, with our sense of greed and acquisition, with pride, with sometimes anger and wrath in some ways, and so there is that side of things. And so when you make purity, like here's purity, you need to achieve this, you're creating a situation where you're creating a lot of shame when people are basically have not arrived yet. And we're expecting a lot out of 18-year-olds at that point. I think you're right on that, in that regard too. Yeah, you want to add to that?
Yeah, because I think I'm talking from a sense of personal experience where I had terrible issues with pornography just because my parents didn't know how to do like parental blockers. So it's like it was no one's fault. It's just that I happened to go upon it. But it is, you go to church, and it is, the shame is palpable, and you don't know how to talk about it because you don't want to be viewed negatively.
Yeah.
You don't know what to do with that sin, and it created a real numbness. Like, it's like you feel so bad, it created just this nasty apathy that followed me probably into my early 20s. And then finally you meet people that have these good conversations about faith, and then you kind of realize that there's a gray area. But I think I think we tend to start simple with kids because we start rigid because you want to kind of build the basis, but it feels like that rigidity doesn't change. It's like there's one level and then we just don't give them the next level. Like, it's like, here's the rigid, but then there's the nuance as you get older and you have more experiences. So I think it's just, as we think about it, I think those are just things to consider so that we can include people and make them aware and want to change their behavior, but also not ostracize them and push them away from something we ultimately want to use to help them. So
yeah,
that's just
I think that's an excellent point. Lust is the one vice that we've created a great deal of shame around in a way that I don't think we've really created around any of the other vices in our modern Western way of looking at these things, and that carries its own. You've said that very well, very, 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 insightfully and eloquently on that. Yeah, things to think about with that. Well, thank you very much. With that, let us go to worship, because God has gifts to give to us that can help build our character. So, thank you. Okay.
That was really great.